Welcome, everyone. I'm Martha McCoy, and on behalf of Public Agenda and the Club de Madrid, I welcome you to the third webinar in a series on global learning on democratic innovation. These webinars explore how we can make democracy work in new and better ways and respond to the challenges that are undermining trust and driving divisions, tensions, and violence in the United States and around the world. This webinar series is an extension of the work of both Public Agenda and the Club de Madrid. Public Agenda is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to creating a stronger, more inclusive, more participatory democracy for everyone. Through research, communications, and public engagement, Public Agenda focuses on raising up the voices of the public, bridging divides to facilitate progress, and strengthening relationships between institutions and the people they serve. The webinars will feed into Public Agenda's Healthier Democracies initiative, supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which aims to gather examples of democratic innovation from around the world to share with public officials. Club de Madrid is an independent, nonpartisan association of over 110 democratic former heads of state and government from some 70 countries who leverage their unique leadership experience to strengthen democratic practice around the world. These webinars are part of Club de Madrid's Shared Societies project, funded by the Alan B. Slifka Foundation, which aims to promote inclusive democratic societies. And I am honored to be the moderator of today's session. I'm the executive director of Everyday Democracy, an organization that supports racially equitable participation, public problem solving, and shared governance across the United States. So about today. Today's panel comes at a critical moment of racial reckoning in the United States and across the globe. In countries across the world, the relationship among people from different racial, ethnic, and religious groups is complicated, contested, and rife with the unaddressed history and current day conditions of injustice. Communities and countries need to address that history somehow in order to promote justice, reduce tensions and violence, and establish stronger connections among people from different groups. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions have been used in countries such as South Africa, Canada, Chile, and Australia to achieve these goals. Today, there are growing calls for holding a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States. In this session, we will hear from leaders from around the world about what we can learn from the experiences of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and other similar democratic innovations. So this is how today's session will flow. I will introduce each speaker and ask each one of them to speak for a few moments from their own experiences and perspective. After that, we'll take 15 minutes for some back and forth among them. In the final portion, the panelists will take your questions, or as many as is practical. We hope that this will be a conversation that will continue in multiple ways after today. This session is being recorded, so you will be able to review and share this session afterward. And as the recording comes to you in coming days, it will also include some additional resources. So before we begin, I'll do a little bit of housekeeping. As a reminder of Zoom etiquette, which we have all grown accustomed to in the past 15 months, unless you are a presenter, please keep yourself muted throughout the webinar. But please feel free to tweet about this session using the hashtags #Healthier Democracies and #Shared Societies. And please post questions all along the way in the Q&A function. So we'll start by hearing from our esteemed panelists. Each one will share their reflections on processes designed to support truth-telling and to promote reconciliation and justice. Our first panelist is the Right Honorable Kim Campbell. Kim Campbell is the former Prime Minister of Canada. During her term, Campbell participated in major international meetings, including the Commonwealth, NATO, the G7 Summit, and the United Nations General Assembly. The Prime Minister has also served as a member of the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia and in the Canadian House of Commons. In January of 1989, Campbell was appointed Minister of State for Indian Affairs and Northern Development. In February of 1990, she was appointed Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. Then in January of 1993, she was appointed Minister of National Defense and Minister of Veterans Affairs. The Prime Minister was the first woman to hold the Justice and Defense portfolios and the first woman to be the Defense Minister of a NATO country. After her tenure as Prime Minister, Campbell was the Canadian Consul General in Los Angeles from 1996 to 2000. She is a member of the International Women's Forum, a global organization of women of significant and diverse achievement, served as its president from 2003 to 2005, and was inducted into the International Women's Forum Hall of Fame in 2008. Campbell is a founding member of the Club of Madrid. She was acting president from its founding in 2002 to 2003. She then served as vice president until January of 2004, when she was named Secretary General. She is a trustee of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and Political Violence at King's College, London. It is a true honor to welcome Prime Minister Campbell here today. Thank you for being with us and for sharing reflections from the experience of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission work in Canada.
Thank you very much. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me? Because I have a little line to my. Okay. I'm very pleased to be of Madrid. Our members like to share their knowledge, their experience, their access, and their club, both to convene experts and other leaders around the world to work with current leaders. And the Shared Societies Project has been one of our most important priorities, because over 90% of the world's countries have minorities of at least 10%. So I wanted to speak very quickly about the Canadian experience, because sometimes people think that Canada is a country that does not have racial tensions, and that is not true. I'm going to focus in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission about our unfortunate history with our Indigenous people. But it is also true, for example, that Chinese people who came to build the railway in the late 19th and early 20th centuries faced a head tax, faced a great deal of discrimination, and did not even get the right to vote until after World War II. People of color, Canadians like to pride themselves in being the end terminus of the Underground Railroad during the period of America's struggle against slavery. But African Americans who came to Canada didn't always necessarily get the best possible reception. They have dealt with prejudice. And one of the things that, and I suppose over different periods of our history, different people have come from different parts of the world and encountered misunderstanding or hostility. And before I talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of the things I want to say is that I think the narratives of our society are extremely important in laying the groundwork for racial justice and reconciliation. The stories we tell about ourselves, and one of the things that often underpins exclusion, are very distorted views of our own history. And Canadians don't like to think of themselves as being a colonial country. Well, we are. And we don't like to think of the fact that we are excluding people. But one of the important things that we can do is to highlight the accomplishments of people of all different backgrounds, all races, both genders, I might add, the two founding genders. When we tell their stories, we come to see members of these groups as people of worth and of merit. But when we don't tell their stories, and I think with Indigenous people in Canada, somebody in the United States just recently, one of your senators said something about, well, you know, we came here and it was a blank slate and there was nothing here, and what did we ever learn from Indigenous people? Well, you might start with the fact that the 13 colonies based their governance system on the Iroquois Confederacy, because that was a form of government that was in fact unknown in Europe. And if we don't tell the stories of what we learned from Indigenous people, and I don't just mean, you know, what plants you could eat and what you couldn't, although most of the early Europeans, certainly who came to my part of the country in Canada, would not have survived were it not for the survival wisdom of the people who had lived there for a very long period of time. But when we write about people, as if we talk about people, as if they have nothing to offer, as if none of them have ever accomplished anything, we deny ourselves the role models that erode our own bigotries, the bigotries that everyone develops by virtue of living in a particular landscape that may exclude certain kinds of people. And so just as it's very important for the fact that women have accomplished a great many more things than they've ever been given credit for, as scientists, as astronomers, as doctors, and all sorts of creative and important contributions to modern civilization. If we don't know about that, then it's easy for us to accept their exclusion. And the same thing is true in every society with people of racial minorities, that we write them out of the story. And the New York Times recently started a new provision in its obituary column called Overlooked No More. But a few years ago, they said, you know, since 1850, we've been writing about white men. And they've now gone back into American history, and not just American history, and have started writing about men and women, people of color, people not the usual suspects for being honored, people not part of the establishment. And what people have discovered is all sorts of extraordinary accomplishments by people who never got celebrated. And so I think this is really important for society to say, whose stories are we telling? And who are we giving credit to? You know, when we read about the Tulsa Massacre, when President Trump unfortunately decided to have a little Juneteenth celebration in Tulsa. What's so interesting about that is it's one of a whole number of scenarios where incredibly accomplished African Americans were killed and their communities destroyed because their accomplishment was seen as an offense and as an affront to a vision that people had, racist people had, about their entitlement to succeed. And very often, because we don't want to think of people that we are oppressing or treating in an inferior way, of seeing them as gifted, smart people, any chance they get to excel, they will, we don't tell their stories, or in the case of things like the Tulsa Massacre, we actually attack and kill people in order to destroy the evidence of the fundamental equality of people of a different race, because racists don't want to believe that. So let me now get very quickly to the Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. In Canada, our Indigenous population, this is one of the things, when I became the Minister of State for Indian Affairs and Northern Development, I was part of a development in Canada that redrew the boundaries of our Northern Territories. And the Northwest Territories was divided into two new territories, one which was to be governed by the Dene people, what Americans would call Native Americans, and the other, Nunavut, which was to be governed by Inuit people. And I remember at the time thinking, what is this thing? Is this a racial franchise? What is this? But in actual fact, what has happened is the example of these local communities, because all of the people in the North, they're not all alike. The Dene people are not the same as the Inuit people. They have different cultures, different language, different traditions. Their example of self-government, their example of empowerment is a very important refutation to the image that other parts of the country may have about such people. So I see, for example, the new, Department of, what is it you call the United States? The Interior Department. Has a First Nations, a Native American woman as the secretary. Having that visual example of an empowered person from a group that's not normally seen as being empowered can be incredibly important. And I think in Canada, the creation of the new Northwest Territories and Nunavut has been an extremely interesting example for us, because it has generated people who are governing themselves, who are showing their capacity to govern. I mean, they're just as smart and able as anybody else. And in fact, probably more so when you consider some of the challenges that they faced to survive in those territories. So those kinds of examples of empowerment are extremely important. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was designed to deal with one piece of a very bad part of the Canadian history with Indigenous people. And that was a desire really to assimilate First Nations people into broader society. I think the expression that was used is to put children in school and take the Indian out of the child. And the experience was awful. Many of these schools were run by various religious denominations. And the experience of the young people who went there was awful. First of all, they were torn from their families. So they were cut off from their own culture. They were punished for speaking their own native languages. And in many cases, because they were isolated and alone and didn't see their families for a long time, they were emotionally and sexually abused. And so this is a blot on our history of the decades of this terrible wrenching apart of First Nations communities. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission allowed people to come and tell their stories. And I don't have time now to go into all of the details, but But one of the things that I think is important about the process of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and incidentally, the government of Canada has paid very important recompense to First Nations people who suffered from this terrible experience. But I think more important, I was in Nunavut, and I saw in a community hall a frame with inside it was the declaration from Prime Minister Harper, as he then was in Canada, apologizing to Indigenous people in Canada for the experience of the residential schools. And for the people there, that apology was so important. People want recognition of what they were put through. They want acknowledgement. And more than any kind of financial recompense, although that was helpful, was this moral reckoning, this moral taking of responsibility. So what a Truth and Reconciliation process can do is help a society take the moral responsibility for things, evils that it has done or that have been done in its name. And that, for those who were the victims of those processes, is incredibly important. And I'll just conclude with one more comment, because we'll come back to this. But I think when I think about South Africa and its Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the stories that were told, I think for many white South Africans, those stories were really horrifying, because of course they knew how awful and brutal the apartheid regime was. But listening, being forced to listen to the reality of what that meant in the lives of individual flesh and blood human beings was very excruciating. And I think for the Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, that came out with 94 calls to action for things to do that institutions could actually focus on doing, which is a very important kind of an outcome. But I think the stories themselves were horrifying. And I'm just going to conclude by telling you, one, that I have been chairing an independent advisory board on Supreme Court of Canada appointments. And certainly that's a really interesting question. Should there be a special seat on the court for Indigenous people, or should we simply have Indigenous people as part of every other part of the process to be judges? But one of the committee members of the first two iterations I did of this was a First Nations person from the Northwest Territories. And he said to me one day, he didn't talk about this very much, but after we were together and he trusted me, he said, he was a man in his 60s. He said, stay in bed after I wake up. He said, for most of my life, if I woke up, even if it was in the middle of the night, I had to get up and get dressed. He said, I could not stay in bed. And I could not, my wife couldn't tell you, I couldn't even, if she don't bring me a coffee, I'm not going to stay in bed. I have to get up. He said, because for me, bed was not a safe place. And bed was not a place you stayed if you were awake and you didn't have to. And you think about that and the kind of trauma that means for people. So how we can connect with people, how we can honor their pain, how we can find constructive ways of presenting that from happening. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, if the broader population pays attention, they can be a very important part of a moral reckoning and growth on the part of a broader population, as well as an acknowledgement of wrong done to a community that needs to feel that acknowledgement. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. Prime Minister Campbell, thank you so much for laying such a powerful groundwork for today's conversation, not only from the Canadian experience, but experiences around the globe. So thank you. Next, I'll introduce Dr. Bonny Ibhawoh. Dr. Ibhawoh teaches human rights history and African history at McMaster University, Canada, where he also heads the McMaster Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. He has taught in universities in Africa, Europe, and North America, including at Brock University and the University of North Carolina at Asheville. He was Human Rights Fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, Research Fellow at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and Associate Member of the Center for African Studies at the University of London. Dr. Ibhawoh currently chairs the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development. He is the author of Human Rights in Africa, 2018, Imperial Justice, published in 2013, and Imperialism and Human Rights, published in 2007. When you receive your resources, you'll be receiving something that Dr. Ibhawoh has written about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Dr. Ibhawoh, thank you for being with us today and for sharing your reflections on Truth and Reconciliation Commissions across the globe.
Thank you very much, Marta, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very honored to be on this panel with the Prime Minister and my distinguished colleagues. So I am going to speak briefly today about some of the findings we've made in our study of truth commissions around the world. So the motivation for this study is as truth commissions have become more and more globalized, we thought it might be necessary to study these truth commissions with a view to understanding best practices. You know, how do they work? And what should we be looking out for as more and more countries adopt the truth commission model? So we have worked in about 17 countries now across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, increasingly also in the West, with the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And you know, we have become a resource for communities that are thinking of establishing their own grassroots truth commissions, and sometimes policymakers who are also thinking about this process. So I will just start by following up on what the Prime Minister talked about, the value of truth commissions. Assessments of the value of truth commissions are mixed. At every given time, you will find people who passionately believe in the model of a truth commission, like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who chaired the South African Truth Commission. He's a passionate advocate of the Truth Commission model. But on the other hand, you will find both scholars, policymakers, and activists who are deeply skeptical of the Truth Commission model, seeing its deficiencies. And like, you know, I was chatting with the Prime Minister before we started. There's no one size fits all when it comes to Truth Commission. At our center, we've identified very roughly at least 5 typologies. Post-authoritarian truth commissions like those that happened in Latin America in the 80s, post-conflict truth commissions like those that have happened across Africa from Liberia to Sierra Leone, democratic transition truth commissions like the South African Truth Commissions, and what we call the historical atrocity truth commission. And this is what you're seeing more and more of in the West, Canadian truth commissions, not so much aimed at democratic transition, but with addressing historical atrocities or injustice. I know the Nordic countries are also thinking about truth commissions, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, to come to terms with the historical injustices against the indigenous Sami people and you know, Greenlanders. The United States, of course, there's conversations about truth commissions for slavery. And those are different kind of truth commissions, focused more on historical injustices than contemporary democratic transitions. And then, of course, you have what's becoming an emergent trend of grassroots truth commission, you know, people taking things into their hands. When the state has proved either unwilling or unable to initiate truth commission processes, local people drawing on local resources have taken the initiative to establish their own truth-seeking and truth-finding processes. A prominent one is the Greensboro Truth Commission in North Carolina, South Africa, in North Carolina in the United States that sought to address you know, violence against the African Americans by the Ku Klux Klan in the 70s. So truth commissions are all over the place. But the one thing that I think ties all these models together is something that the Prime Minister has mentioned. When we go back to countries where truth commissions have been experimented with, whether it's South Africa or in Chile or in Morocco, or even here in Canada, and we ask people who were part of these processes, whether as, you know, alleged perpetrators, victims, policymakers, what is the one takeaway that you can point to in being part of this process? We get a whole load of responses, and we get people who are skeptical, we get people who are positive. But one of the things that I think is consistent, and we see this across the board, is people mention 3 things. They mention acknowledgement, they mention recognition, and they mention representation. We can debate whether truth commissions succeed in the task of actually finding the truth, the historical truth about what happened. We can even debate the question of whether truth commissions ultimately succeed in bringing justice to victims. We may even debate whether truth commissions are successful in bringing about reconciliation. In fact, many truth commissions around the world omit reconciliation altogether and focus more on truth finding and justice. And we can debate all of this. But the one thing that I think there's an emergent consensus on is that truth commissions provide a space for a narrative of pain, for those who feel they've been disenfranchised, those who feel they've been victims of injustice, to articulate in a public way their pain and have the broader societies understand, hear this. Now, in some cases, the sponsoring authorities, the states, take this further and act on the recommendations. But even in cases where sponsoring authorities haven't acted on recommendations of truth commissions, we find that those who participated in truth commission process come out of it saying, I am glad that my stories have been heard. I am glad that I had the opportunity to tell my stories. And I think this is important because in the Truth Commission debate, you find traditionalists who argue that being a quasi-judicial process, it doesn't really address question of, justice in the retributive sense of the word. But the argument that those of us who think truth commissions have a place in society is that not all questions can be addressed. Not all social problems can be addressed with a retributive justice model. And truth commissions offer a model of restorative justice that meets certain needs in societies. Just to go back to the South African example, for instance, during the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there were, of course, skeptics who felt that, the process could have been more judicial. The ANC should have appointed a retired judge to head the Truth Commission rather than an Anglican priest that knows nothing of the law, and all of that criticism. But and one of the things that came out of the South African Truth Commission was that when you actually talk to those who appeared before the Truth Commission, many of them will say it provided an opportunity for me to tell my stories. I've heard women who said, I finally found out where my son was buried. I found out what happened to my son. I found out what happened to my husband. And for me, that is some justice. Might not be all justice, but that for me is some justice. And I think that when we evaluate the value of Truth Commission and what it holds, and I think this is particularly relevant to the ongoing debates in the United States, so much of the discussion tends to focus on material restitution. How much will be paid? What will be given, in recompense for this? And I urge for a shift in how we think about truth commissions, in the sense that the focus should be on what can be gained in terms of society coming to terms with this historical injustice and trying to repair that harm. I want to end with an anecdote that I think really captures some of the value, the intrinsic value of the Truth Commission model that might not be so evident when you think about it in very materialistic and utilitarian terms. So we work here at the McMaster Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice with Indigenous communities. And one of the things we've been doing is we've been trying to gauge public attitudes towards Truth Commission, not just when the report is released or a year after the report is released. We want to track these over time. And we've done this in South Africa, short-term, medium-term, and long-term assessments of the impacts and legacies of Truth Commissions. So one of the things we've done in Canada is we've gone back to Indigenous people who've participated and some who haven't participated in the Truth Commission to ask, 2-3 years down the road, did you think it was worth it? Do you think it's changed anything in your life and how, the world sees you and your place in Canadian society? And one of the most telling responses I got was from a student research assistant who worked with us. And I said to her, how has the Truth Commission affected you? And she didn't go into all the intricacies that academics like us are interested in, but she said, well, I don't know about the long-term impact, but the one thing I know is that when I show my status card at the local gas station, I no longer get the kind of condescending looks I used to get. I get a sense that people understand where I'm coming from better. The CBC had just done a series on the Truth Commission, and the narrative was in the public domain. And she said, I notice a change. I am no longer ashamed when I show my status card. I feel that there is a community that understands where I'm coming from. And for me, that was very important. That is telling. I mean, that's a sentiment that might not be captured in the usual matrix and rubrics of what works and what doesn't work. But it speaks to the silent power of the Truth Commission model, that it allows societies to confront their past in a way that are not easily seen or may not be very evident. And I think this is why Truth Commissions are still relevant for all their limitations. And we acknowledge those who do this work. We acknowledge the limitations. They can be used as instruments of legitimizing state power. They can be used as instruments of creating even further division sometimes in post-conflict societies. But at the end of the day, we believe that we have enough information since the emergence of this model in the 1980s to begin to think about the value of Truth Commissions and to begin to think about how we can do them well in ways that create and build more inclusive societies. I'll stop there and hopefully we can continue later on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibhawoh. That was really very useful for building on what the Prime Minister said and offering us some real food for thought. And already some great questions are coming into the Q&A. So that's great. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our third panelist, James Malloy, who will give us a view from the United States at this critical time in the US. James, or as he goes by Jim Molloy, is a local government expert, currently serving as town manager in Lexington, Massachusetts, and president of the International City County Management Association, ICMA. He previously served for 9 years as the town manager in Westboro, Massachusetts, and 15 years as town administrator in Sturbridge, Massachusetts, in addition to municipal management positions in both New York and Colorado. The International City County Management Association advances professional local government management worldwide through leadership, management, innovation, and ethics. ICMA provides member support, publications, data and information, peer and results-oriented assistance, and training and professional development to more than 12,000 city, town, and county experts and other individuals and organizations throughout the world. Shortly after his appointment as president of ICMA, James Molloy announced his commitment to expand ICMA's racial equity and inclusion work to provide ICMA members with content, training, and tools to help them address issues of systemic racism, including in relation to policing, public health, and human and social needs. Again, when you receive your materials, you'll be receiving a statement of ICMA on systemic racism and racial justice. So it's a great honor and pleasure to welcome you, Jim Molloy. Thank you for being with us today to share what you are seeing across the United States.
Thank you very much. I'm also honored to be included on this panel, especially given the subject matter expertise from my fellow panelists. One of the things that I'm going to be discussing is the transferability of the international truth and reconciliation process in the context of the US experience. The US experience regarding racism and mistreatment of marginalized communities dates back hundreds of years. It has reached a new boiling point with the murder of George Floyd in 2020. I say a new boiling point because we've reached this point before and have not been able to address the issues of systemic racism that date back to the founding of our country. Remember, all men are created equal, but not really. The post-Civil War Reconstruction failures, to Jim Crow laws, to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And now we find ourselves at this crossroads once again with the murder of George Floyd and sadly others that has resulted in national protest and outrage. The success of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions around the globe as a means of creating transitional justice by seeking truth in the form of a single authoritative narrative, providing immediate criminal justice, permanently memorializing the harm, and developing reforms in the form of reconciliation or reparations to address long-term harm that had previously been inflicted is a demonstrated successful mechanism that would assist us in the United States in addressing the systemic racism issues that have plagued us for years. The concern about whether it could be implemented on a national level is a different issue. In the form that it's been utilized with positive experiences in other countries is questionable, only given the backdrop of the intolerance and the divisive nature of our current national politics. There are two bills that are currently in the US Congress that seek to establish Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. One is to examine the United States history of racial abuse and to develop an honest and truthful narrative, as well as to establish transformative goals. The second, which Elizabeth Warren, one of the US senators from Massachusetts, is one of the co-sponsors, and which I believe is similar to the issue that was addressed in Canada, which hopefully could serve as a model for the US, would review the Native American boarding school policy in the United States, which was designed to forcibly assimilate Indigenous children into white culture. Both of these bills have broad Democratic support, but no Republican support at all. The question of the success of a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission process in the US would be bolstered through an intergovernmental cooperative process that would include state and local governments. Given the geography and the size of the United States and the regional ideologies, it may be better if the truth-seeking process occurred locally and regionally and then was fed to the federal government as a potentially more successful process, as opposed to a simple top-down national approach. At the same time, the process needs the backing of the federal government to provide the weight of the federal government, and the reconciliation or reparation should be national, as our issues of systemic racism are a national issue. For example, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that reviewed issues related to America's history of slavery, there may be many facts that could be researched and reported on a local and regional basis within a region of the US and then reported back to the federal government. Each region of the US would have a differing experience. So while it's a national issue, state and local participation would be very important in developing the context in which the issue should be examined. Because local government has many historical records, a cooperative exercise that included states in a regional approach with the federal government perhaps would be more successful with the federal government being more involved in the reconciliation portion of the process. I've been struck by some of the articles that I've read on this topic that indicate that the transformation created through the Truth and Reconciliation process is a generational process and not something that can provide short-term fixes when juxtaposed against the ongoing issues the US has with police violence against people of color and the immediacy so many Americans feel right now for change. I'm currently involved in a Kettering Foundation, National Civic League, and ICMA Leadership Institute on Race, Equity, and Inclusion. And at the last meeting, one of the other fellows, who's a Black local government leader, expressed his frustration that it's been a year since George Floyd was murdered by the now former Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin. And we continue to see the same thing sadly reoccur repeatedly. While in the US, we continue to rely only on the criminal justice system to adjudicate these issues and address what is commonly referred to as just a few bad apples. In reality, the issues of systemic racism in the US go much deeper than a few bad apples. We have a problem of historic systemic racism that has created economic inequality through redlining and banking laws and pay inequities, educational inequality, and criminal justice inequality, among other injustices. The successes of global leaders in utilizing the process of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions can work in the US, but would benefit from an intergovernmental cooperative process addressing regional issues with the federal government backing. Truth commissions can provide a single authoritative narrative, foster constructive dialogue on race and racism in the US, and could help us make transformational recommendations. Where Truth and Reconciliation Commissions have been used successfully in other countries, that have suffered multiple issues at once. It could be used to help the US cope with the one issue of systemic racism, and is clearly an idea whose time has come. A solution to our ongoing issues is needed, and now is a good time to start. Thank you very much. With that, I'll just join my fellow panelists in responding to any questions that our moderator or any of the attendees have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those really powerful words that are doing truth-telling about what's happening and what has happened in the United States and the difficulties of doing so. I think that so many rich questions are coming up from the Q&A that I think I'm going to put a couple of those questions out right away, because you've already responded to each other and you've already built on one another's work in such beautiful ways as you've spoken. One of the questions that I think is really powerful, and Dr. Ibhawoh, maybe we'll start with you on this, but it builds on something that the Prime Minister said about how history, the importance of the narrative and how narrative gets distorted or repressed. And so one of the questions is, how can we ensure that people learn history and prevent history from being repressed? I'd love to start with you, but I'd love to hear from all the panelists. And as you build on each other's remarks, I know that will be rich.
History and learning from history is central, I think, to the work of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Almost every Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we have studied has a section on memorialization and commemoration. And that goes back to the point we've made before about acknowledgement and recognition. And these manifest either in museums or, a commemorative day. And it goes back to the point that's been earlier made, that recognition and history are the roots. Coming to terms with history is at the root of the work of Truth Commission. And so one of the things that I think is an argument for Truth Commission is that it provides an opportunity for society to confront its past. So our project is called the Confronting Atrocity Project, coming to terms with that history. And it starts with education. It starts with education. It starts with public recognition that these atrocities or these injustices were committed, and that there is a need to remedy them. And this is something we've heard from the victims themselves. Those who are, victim groups are saying that this is the first thing we want on the recommendation, and we can deal with restitution, we can deal with reparations later on, but the very first thing we want is recognition. And I think the Prime Minister alludes to that in the story of the indigenous community that has the apology mounted on the wall. And it speaks to why this is important. Unfortunately, and this is something we see, is that either because of a lack of political will, or just in the case of many truth commissions in the developing world, this historical dimension to the work of Truth Commission really isn't taken seriously. So, for example, one of the things we found is that Truth Commission records, particularly in less resource developing countries in the global south, are nowhere to be found only 2 years after the end of the Truth Commission process. So we go back to these countries and say, well, we want to evaluate what happened with a view to understanding how this process works, and nobody knows where the records are. The society has moved on. It has served its function, and that's where some of the concerns come from, that Truth Commission processes can be instrumentalist, they can be used by regimes to legitimize their rule and then just discarded thereafter. And those are very real concerns. And some of the things that we try to emphasize when we work with policymakers and grassroots organizations involved in Truth Commission process is that we emphasize archiving. We emphasize follow-up, that when states are thinking about truth commissions, it's not just the cost of setting it up and paying the commissioners. They should be factoring the cost of maintaining the archives, the cost of public education, the cost of memorialization process, because ultimately the success or failure of Truth Commission as a model of justice rests on the abilities of the sponsoring authorities to follow through on the recommendations of these commissions.
I wonder if I could just add something to that question, because it's a very important question. You know, there's a saying that history is written by the victors. And the sensitivity of genius, you see this in the United States, that any effort by historians to be critical of the kind of Yankee Doodle approach to telling American history is often denounced as being disloyal. It's a very hard thing to do. People don't want to know the truth. They don't want to know that their heroes were either not heroes or were complicated people. We've seen this in Canada. Our first prime minister was an amazing person, Sir Johnny MacDonald, but he was also a racist when it came to our Indigenous people. And we are struggling with how we balance that. But one of the things I think that we have as a tool is, in fact, the media and entertainment media, that there are ways in which stories can be told through good movies, good television stories, good series. I saw an interesting documentary on Netflix recently about the 14th Amendment, which was an incredible revelation to me. It was presented in a very interesting way. Now, not that everybody's going to watch things. You can't, you can create the documentary or you can create the good movie and not necessarily everybody will watch it. But I think for those who just had no idea, I think of the movie Hidden Figures and how I watched it in a state of rage thinking, why don't I know about these women, these 3 African-American women, mathematicians, computer scientists, who were integral to the development of the American space program? I need to know about them. Boys and girls need to know about them. So I think for those of us who understand that it's hard to get history departments to be able to do, even when historians are willing, and historians are writing great history, folks, but sometimes the entertainment media or the softer versions of those educational forms, and I think of the American TV writer Shonda Rhimes. I don't know if any hospitals are like Seattle Grace, but the TV shows that she writes present a picture of people of all races and all permutations and combinations as smart, professional people. They have dramas, they have love affairs, but there's an overall recognition of skill and giftedness among people of all different races. And I love them because I think she is telling a story where subliminally the message is smart people look like that. And that's what a doctor looks like. Is there, a short African-American woman who's the chief of surgery in a hospital? I don't know, but I totally believe that there is one there at Seattle Grace. So I think that there are other ways that we can tell those stories and begin to get people's attention, and then perhaps creating an appetite for more of the serious historical exploration. But the historians are creating the foundation for doing that. The stories are real, and we have to figure out the ways to tell them to get an audience for them.
Wonderful comments. Jim Malloy, I wonder if you might want to comment on sort of the tensions around how history is presented in the United States these days and what you're encountering as you work in this country and across the globe.
Yeah, I have to say that the Prime Minister, her comment about the victors write the history is absolutely accurate. And the problem that we have in the US as researchers are doing more thorough jobs in uncovering real histories is that whoever's on the other side of an issue that may be presented by the development of more accurate history will simply just refer to it as revisionism. And it's become a sort of a political hot potato. And how we get to the point of wanting to really have the truth in history is just such an important question. And it's one of the items that this truth and reconciliation process, if it's done in a nonpartisan or bipartisan manner in the US, you're going to be able to get to the truth at some point in time and be able to come to an agreement on what that is. And I think that's necessary to move forward, because right now we have such a problem in the US where more conservative people in the United States will say a certain thing happened. More progressive people in the United States will say, no, it was this, and they don't come to terms. And so there's no agreement on what the actual history is. And that's the biggest problem that we have right now. So I don't know what they could be teaching in school. I remember what I was taught when I took history. My minor in college was in history. And a lot of what I was taught has been challenged since then, and challenged successfully that it wasn't accurate. And so that's important, and it's important that we get to what the real truths are so that we can move forward in a productive way.
You know, this line of conversation is so rich, and it's very connected to something else that has been in the Q&A section, which is something that always comes up when we have conversations around systemic racism, and that is about preaching to the choir. And I would say that I've heard different answers to that over time, and I have different answers myself, but one of the things that has become more apparent in this country over the last few years is that the extreme polarization we're facing is so racialized. And so it's made exactly the dynamic that you were talking about, Jem, has been part of that. And so you know, one of the questions, I guess, for you all is to think about, if we think, which we all need to do, think hard and creatively about how to enter into this extremely racially polarized moment, or racialized polarized moment, in order to speak into that space. Where do we begin? Are there analogies in history to that kind of, are there experiences that you all know about that could speak into the experience of the United States right now?
If I may, I think the question about preaching to the choir, it's a very legitimate one. And this is where the whole point that Jim makes about why in the United States, the approach might have to be intergovernmental. And I understand that, given, you know, like he's rightly said, the polarization, ideological and polarization in the United States. But if we must transcend speaking to the choir, we need some of the power, the legitimacy, and the force of the state, of the federal government. And I make an analogy with the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was the fact that this was a national project that brought the kind of visibility to the process that no one, frankly, could escape. I can imagine a scenario where the government, the provincial government in, say, Manitoba, would have said, well, because many of the residential schools were here and we have a large Indigenous population, let's make this a provincial Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and maybe cascade it up to the federal government at some point. I know the politics and the structures of both countries are different, but I don't think that would have had as much of an impact as a Truth Commission mandated by the state, by the federal government, that had the power and the legitimacy of the federal government behind it. I think that is one way of going beyond the choir, because it brings some force to the process when the sponsoring authority is the state. The other way to transcend preaching to the choir really is through the messaging. And that is something we haven't talked much about here today. When the South African government of Nelson Mandela first initiated the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it was deeply, deeply unpopular among the Black population. I remember reading the South African newspaper, pro-ANC newspaper, where Mandela was vilified for this idea. You know, people said the old man had lost his mind, and that several years in prisons had led him to lose his mind. How would he even think about reconciliation, given what the Black population had experienced? Truth Commission had to be consciously sold through an indigenous African philosophy of Ubuntu. Desmond Tutu went on the road to sell the idea that this is something that will ultimately benefit us. This is something that is good for us. And yet, at the end of the day, not everyone was convinced, but to a large extent, the effort of the ANC and proponents like Mandela and Tutu and the moral courage and force that they brought to the process gradually got a majority of the Black population of South Africa on board. And I think that has to be part of the process, conversation in the United States, as in any countries, that the hard work of letting people see the value, those who will traditionally not be will be opposed to the idea, see the value of a truth commission. I mean, when I speak in the United States, one of the things, particularly when I speak at institutions in the global, in the US South, where the idea of a truth commission tends to meet with skepticism and resistance, I tell them, what would you rather have? Begin the conversation now or kick it down the road to your kids? Because it is not going away. There's going to be the first civil rights movement, the Black Lives Matter is the second civil rights movement. And unless you get this conversation, there's going to be a third, a fourth, a fifth. And so if you're really interested in making things better for your kids, start the conversation now. And I think to some extent that gets their attention, and then they want to talk more about this.
The idea of messaging is so powerful. And in this era of social media bubbles and disinformation, I would say that the challenges of effective messaging are, I don't know if I should say even greater than ever before, but it certainly feels like that from my perspective. Prime Minister, I wonder if you have any words about the messaging that happened in Canada around truth and reconciliation, and whether there is ongoing messaging as recommendations are playing out. There was a question in the Q&A about the what is the strength behind the recommendations coming out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission actually being implemented. So that sort of seems like it would require ongoing public will and understanding.
Well, I think it's not an even thing, but I think many institutions took the calls to action quite seriously. I was creating a program at the University of Alberta from 2014 to 2018, and the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission were considered very important there. And what's really important, and I see Dr. Ibhawoh would agree with this, that the more specific you can be about the things that people can do, the more likely you are to get follow-up. If it's just, you should feel bad and not do this anymore. First of all, nobody likes to be told they're a bad person. And, just to sort of to drift up, in fact, the way you actually get people to internalize a change of values is to give them something concrete to do, a task that they can do, a process that they can participate in. And I think part of the messaging too is trying to get away from the zero-sum thing. I mean, the interesting thing is that in the world, and even in our countries, the places that are often the most creative, the most prosperous, et cetera, are the ones that are the most heterogeneous, where you have, mixtures of people, of colors, of backgrounds, whatever. But in the United States, certainly a lot of Americans have been sold this bill of good. We don't, it's like, I think Lyndon Johnson said that even a white person will put up with being poor as long as the Black guy's poor. We don't want to have these things. We don't want to have a social safety net. We don't want to have these things because these undeserving people will get it too. And yet it's not a zero-sum game. The fact of the matter is, we lift up all society when everybody gets to contribute and when we come to appreciate it. But you almost have to live that to really understand it. So I think it's you start with small steps. And I think that what Jim Malloy is talking about, and I think local government, I started my political career at the local government level. And I think a lot of people miss how important that is as a cornerstone for democracy. When things work at the local level, people begin to have a positive sense of what governance can mean in their community. But the intimacy and the size and scale of communication can be really, really valuable as kind of tiles in the mosaic of broader change. So I think that when you can have concrete steps that people can take in local, meaningful, visible identifiable communities, that's how you can build on that, as opposed to saying we're going to have this grand sweep where we're all going to, join hands coast to coast singing Kumbaya. No, it doesn't work that way.
Prime Minister, I'm so glad you said that. I'm so glad that you talked about the zero-sum narrative and the power of it. For those of you who haven't yet read Heather McGhee's excellent book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, that's exactly the premise of her book, which is so fabulous. And in the end, she actually talks about local truth and reconciliation commissions in the United States and the power that they could bring. It's interesting because basically her thing is we have been sold a bill of goods that this is a zero-sum game. And so as long as we buy that narrative, we cannot make progress. Jim Molloy, there's a question in the Q&A that builds on this and that is really for you. And that is, how should the deliberative democracy and bridge building field play a role in truth and reconciliation commissions?
That's a good question. I saw it in the Q&A or in the chat. And it's interesting because truth should be based on facts. But if you're in a situation where you've got parties that are disputing what the facts are, there is the opportunity through communication to try to engage each side to figure out what is the accurate fact and hopefully try to get both sides to see what the facts are. But once the truth is identified and agreed upon, I think the deliberative democracy model of working together and reconciling differences to come to a path to move forward is actually where the deliberative democracy process would be most useful in the truth and reconciliation model, is really on how to move forward. Because it's one thing to say, okay, here's where we're at, but then deciding how you're going to move forward from there is probably the more important aspect, because that's what's going to affect people's lives going forward. And so by coming together and using the deliberative democracy model on the reconciliation portion of this process, I think it's probably extremely important.
That speaks to a combination of processes that would be critical. And it also leads to a question of, if communities and countries come to you and say, we'd like to start a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where should we start? What would you say?
That's a great question. I agree with Bonnie that the weight of a federal or national government weighing in on a process like this is probably key to it being successful. But I think the actual fact-finding and conversations need to happen at the local and regional level, because, as I said earlier, especially in a country like the US, where our regions are so diverse, they're so different, that the experiences that people in the Pacific Northwest have is totally different than the Southern experience or the New England experience, or Midwest or the Mountain Plains. It's like we're all totally different people. And I think to get the historical accounts, that's got to be done on a regional basis. And then the conversations on how to move forward should be done even at a lower level. I think the local level, Tip O'Neill once said all politics is local, and he didn't mean that it was political in the local sense. It's that the conversations happened at the local sense. And I see that happening in my own community on national issues. We're having in-depth community conversations. We have facilitation going on, and we have my elected board meeting with community civil groups to discuss race issues. And that's where these kind of conversations can really happen in a productive manner. But they need to be happening in multiple jurisdictions and then feeding upwards to the national conscience.
Can I just say there was something flashed up on the screen, somebody talking about the arts playing a role. And that is also another way to use local and direct content to start conversations. When I was Minister of Justice, I convened a national conference on Aboriginal justice in partnership with the Minister of Justice of the Yukon. And all of the provincial attorneys general, we all met in Whitehorse. We went off to the Yukon. And the first day, before we started our deliberations, we saw a play by a theatrical group from Manitoulin Island, a First Nations group. And the play was called Toronto at Black Rock. And it was a play, a young First Nations boy of that time goes up to a place called Black Rock, a historical meeting place with the caves of beer. And he encounters the spirit of a young Indian boy at the time of contact and another, which seemed like far away, the late 21st century. And it was a play, and it was very funny and very clever and incredibly well done, and really made the point about why First Nations people wanted us to be there talking about Aboriginal justice. But it transcended any kind of mental barrier you had about understanding and went straight to your heart, which to your gut. So when we then sat down and started talking about things, we understood so much more about the broader emotional, historical, cultural context in which we were dealing with this. And I think at local levels, having the performance of a play and then inviting people to sit around after and talk about it, these are ways that you can begin to create conversations, but also use the gift of our artists to frame things in ways that touch us and that help to overcome the kind of mental barriers that we put up when we feel we have to be protective of our turf.
That's wonderful. And Dr. Ibhawoh, I don't know if you want to say one quick thing before we move to the closing section about where you would start.
Yeah, I have to agree with the Prime Minister and Mr. Molloy that it really starts from the heart. It starts with changing hearts. You know, it really resonates with me, the point that nobody wants to be demonized. You know, nobody wants to be seen as the problem. So I think I will start with messaging. And we've talked about the arts, we've talked about media. The other group that that I think will play an important role in this are young people, because the young people have tools that the older generations didn't have. Social media, we know, can be very toxic, can be very destructive, but it can also be very empowering. And chances today are that even a young person who has not had an encounter with, with a person of a different race and person probably has somebody like that on their TikTok forum or their WhatsApp or their Facebook. So there are more places to interact than before. And I think this really opens an opportunity for the kind of conversations, the kind of groundbreaking that have to precede truth commissions. My worry is that truth commissions, when stampeded, are designed to fail. And we've seen this in many parts of the world, countries rushing into truth commission processes, post-conflict truth commission processes, even before the guns fall silent. You know, the war is still on and there's a truth commission process parallel. And that's a recipe for failure. So in the context of the conversation of the United States, I would hope that there's a recognition that while those bills are making their way through Congress or their conversations at local levels, that people also recognize the important preparatory work in terms of a kind of breaking into people's hearts and minds so that they're more receptive to this conversation. And this could be through all the various avenues that we've outlined.
Thank you all so much for your rich insights, your honesty, your way of just cutting through jargon to make us understand the complexity and the necessity of thinking about this. I want to give an opportunity for each one of you to provide us with a 1-minute closing statement what you would like to leave us with, what you would like to leave our audience with, and then I'll talk a little bit about next week's webinar. Prime Minister, can we begin with you?
Well, just very quickly, I'd say work with what you have. You know, I think in the past in Israel, where Palestinian and Israeli women have gotten together across the divide and talked about the challenges for their children's school. The same thing in Northern Ireland when women got together and began to build bridges through talking about the issues that they shared, whether it's using the skills of your artists to engender conversations. Each community is different. Sometimes there can be, churches can meet. And of course, one of the skills of persuasion is find somebody who used to share the contrary view and has changed their mind, and they're often a more credible interlocutor than somebody who has forever had a different view from a particular group. But I think the thing is to always be a human being, always understand that however vexatious some people may be, they are people. And if you address the people concerns, the fear of being left out, the fear of losing, the desire not to be proven wrong, then you'll begin to find the steps in a particular community where you can begin to create the links and the potential for change and dialogue.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ibhawoh.
Yeah, my statement, my last statement will be a simple one, and it is that reconciliation is not a bad word. I find that more and more Truth Commission established these days omit the word reconciliation. I note that even the bill in the US Congress is called the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Commission. By our estimates, the last 7 or 8 commissions that have been established around the world omit the word reconciliation. There is a sense that reconciliation is soppy sentimentalism, that it is too emotional, that states have no business reconciling people, that these are issues for spiritual and religious and emotional people. And I disagree, and I think in the conversations that we have concerning even state-led Truth Commission processes, we should not just end at seeking to find the truth. We should consciously strive to reconcile. And just as kumbaya isn't a bad word, reconciliation isn't a bad word.
Thank you so much. Jim Malloy.
I would just close with saying that I think one of the most important things is active listening. All too often, the reason why people aren't agreeing is that they've already put themselves in a position where they're defending their position. They're not listening to the other people that they're communicating with. And as already has been said, finding commonalities and recognizing that if you win, I lose is not a philosophy to live by, that rising tide lifts all boats is a better one.
Thank you so much. And thank you again to all of you. And thank you again to Public Agenda and the Club de Madrid for sponsoring today's webinar. Thank you for a powerful and rich conversation. Thank you to everyone in the audience who has been really participatory all throughout by putting things in the chat and in the Q&A. And so, as you know, this webinar is the third in a series of 4. And so we invite you to register for the next one, which is scheduled for May 13th. It's going to be a great discussion on democratic innovation and inclusive civic engagement. So thank you again, and thank you for being here, and have a wonderful rest of your week.